Hello, I'm Eric Heikkila, a professor at the USC Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. And this is one in a series of presentations I'm giving on my new book, China from a US Policy Perspective. This presentation provides a bit of an overview, kind of an introduction and a synthesis of key conclusions from the book as a whole. So let's begin with thinking about the motivation for the book. And it's really, I like to use an analogy of the moon and its effect on the tides, where here, China is the moon, and rather than looking at local tides, we're looking at policy, the policy realm within the United States. And even if our focus is strictly on policies within the US, it's imperative that we take into account the influencing of a rising China on that policy context. Now, we do this within three broad categories: an economic perspective, sustainability, and geopolitical perspectives. The first looks at fiscal policy and deficits, trade policy, employment and income. Sustainability perspective looks at climate change, urban policy, energy policy. And the geopolitical perspective encompasses homeland security, including pandemics, defense policy, and foreign relations. So the book as a whole is devoted primarily to these individual topic areas. So those 9 topics are the bulk of the book, comprise the bulk of the book. But what we're doing, and the other presentations that I've posted, look at those 9 areas one by one. But this particular presentation, as I've mentioned, is giving an overview. And an important consideration in this is that each of these policy domains has its own rationale, its own context, its own kind of logic, policy logic behind it. And to get a flavor of this, what I introduce here are 3 different charts, but of similar design. Each chart has blue bars representing the US values, red bars representing the corresponding Chinese values. And this is over the last 3 decades, from 1990 until the most recent data available. And I use 2018 data here, as you can see. And in all cases, the US value for 1990 has been indexed to 100. So that facilitates comparisons over time between categories and between the US and China. And the 3 categories I've chosen here correspond to each of those 3 broad areas I've mentioned. So GDP being a broad indicator to give us some context for the economic policy sphere. Carbon dioxide emissions for the sustainability perspective, and defense expenditures for the geopolitical perspective. So taking a quick look at these, we can see with respect to GDP that over the last 3 decades, US GDP in real terms, so this is after adjusting for inflation, US GDP has about doubled over the last 3 decades. During that same interval, Chinese GDP has increased by a factor of 14. And while China's GDP is still less than that of the US, it's apparent that it's growing very quickly, and at this rate will catch up in another few decades. So that's a quick view of the economic perspective. The sustainability perspective has some similarities, especially with respect to China's growth. In this case, China's growth of carbon dioxide emissions, which is reflective in part of its economic growth, because it's that economic growth and the type of economic growth that China has been experiencing that has given rise to this dramatic increase in carbon dioxide emissions. Now, in contrast, over these last 3 decades, while the US carbon dioxide emissions are almost the same now as they were 30 years ago, and it's a good thing, of course, that those carbon dioxide emissions have not risen here. But this shows that the relationship between the 2 largest emitters of carbon dioxide emissions in the world has itself altered quite fundamentally over time. And lastly, turning to the defense expenditures, again, we can see that US defense expenditures, even today, are much larger than those of China. However, the trend tells a different story. US defense expenditures over the last 3 decades have increased by about 13% in real terms, whereas over that same interval, China's defense expenditures have increased about 13-fold. So there's a rapid increase in those defense expenditures. Now, if we can make some comparison as well by referencing back to GDP figures. If we doing so tells us that China's increase in defense expenditures have been roughly commensurate with its increasing economic growth. Another way to think of this is that China's defense expenditures have been a relatively constant share of a rapidly increasing pie. Whereas in the US, what we've had is US defense expenditures have over time been a diminishing share of a slowly increasing pie. And that's why what's reflected in these figures. So each of the chapters looks at that particular policy domain in a similar way. But while the book as a whole focuses on these topics individually, what we want to do today is look at the relationship between these broad topical areas. And for that purpose, put together this rather charming diagram that is really my sense of how these all hang together. After having written the book and spent so much time on it, this is what I bring away from it. And I'd welcome you all to do your own representation of how these hang together. Some notable things here. Green represents the economic policy topics as before, green for money. Blue represents the sustainability topics, blue for blue skies and blue water. And red represents geopolitical topics for code red, red alert. So looking at this diagram, one of the things that really jumps out is how influential some of these economic topics, particular trade policy, is in terms of the entire configuration. Notice in particular, the thickness of the lines indicates strength of influence between one policy domain and the next. And we can see that trade is the only policy area that has 3 thick lines emerging and another one emerging, trade policy influencing urban policies, but as does employment. But we can see that trade has a strong influence on employment, and that's clear in terms of, for example, election issues about trade with China and its impact on employment and manufacturing here at home. Trade also has strong links with fiscal policy and deficits. That happens to be a two-way street, and so it's represented as such here. And trade has a direct link as well to foreign relations. If we're looking at how we think about the role of the US and its engagement with other nations around the world through international bodies like the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, etc., that's related here as well. So trade has an enormous impact there. Now, see that the other policy domain that has strong link on foreign relations, US foreign relations, is geopolitical. And that stands to reason because geopolitical is by its very nature one that is thinking about interaction between the US and other countries. That holds true for trade as well. And so that's why those are the strongest influences on foreign relations, so both homeland security and defense clearly have those strong links. Homeland security also with links on trade. If we think of things like Huawei and internet technology and thinking about what kinds of trade we want to allow or don't want to allow in terms of exports and imports, and also just thinking about the physical safety of movement of goods. As goods are brought into the US, part of the Homeland Security mission is to make sure that we're kept safe from infiltrations of that sort as well. So if we look then at the sustainability cluster, we see that urban, while having some influence on, for example, homeland security, the way urban policies, way we run our cities has an impact on how we think about homeland security. The way we live our lives in cities also has an influence on energy policy. But urban is significant in being largely a recipient of the influence of other policies, especially as we've noted, trade and employment affect the way our cities evolve. Energy policy helps to affect the way our cities evolve. Homeland security policy also does. Finally, we look at there's a strong link in the sustainability cluster of energy policy and its influence on climate change. What's missing, however, is a link between this sustainability cluster and foreign relations. And so I point to climate change, a kind of a link between climate change and foreign relations as a missing link, especially over this last 4 years. The fact that a former Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been nominated now as the climate change czar for the United States suggests that this missing link may re-emerge. And really, I think it's very vital, very important that it does so. So that's how these different topic areas hang together. It's a kind of a notional sense of that, a notional depiction. Now, what are some of the key lessons that emerge kind of across chapters? We think, what are some of the main lessons? Well, for me, a key lesson that emerges is the importance of global public goods. That there are a lot of things. Climate change is one, kind of the Earth's environment is a global public good. It's something that we all share, whether we like it or not. We can't just carve out a separate space with respect to climate change, for example, for the United States, because it is a global phenomenon. Likewise, unfortunately, with pandemics, it's a global phenomenon. Now, pandemics are not a public good, but the public health, the absence of pandemics is a public good. Likewise, peace and security, and really kind of the institutional context in which we address global problems is also very important linkage. And in this aspect, club theory is very important. Club theory is a branch of economics, of public choice economics, that deals with goods of this nature that are kind of shared goods, and where we're not only sort of sharing consumption of the goods, but we are, through our interaction with each other, sort of generating part of the club that we belong to, and that is in fact a good or the lack of a good, depending upon how these clubs hang together. So while some of the theory behind the technical aspects of club theory can become a little bit mathematical and technical, the notion of a club is actually very useful for understanding the gist of that particular branch of economics. And I feel, through doing the research for this book, it's really vital that we think systematically about the kinds of institutions, the kind of protocols, for example, with respect to trading regimes, climate change regimes, and World Health regimes, and regimes for the protocols we have for trying to maintain a peaceful order in the world. All of these things, there is a lot of work that has been done on the design of institutions that can be effective in dealing with this. And one lesson that really comes through really very strongly in looking across all these chapters is that China, whether we like it or not, is a huge influence on what is going on in the world. And that if we want to make a difference in a positive way, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition that we collaborate with China. It's necessary because if we don't do it, we're really not going to be successful and effective, even though it is an option not to collaborate. But then we're really not going to be successful in attaining the kinds of outcomes that are important to us for ourselves. So it's necessary, but not sufficient. Just going and knocking on China's door or letting them knock on our door and sitting down and talking doesn't necessarily result in positive outcomes. So this is why it's necessary, but not in itself sufficient. And so we need to apply ourselves, and we need to be realistic about how we go about that. And another aspect that comes through very clearly from this, especially when we're talking about trading regimes, when we're talking about Homeland security, when we're talking about defense policy, and so many other areas. This asks somewhat rhetorically the question, who needs friends? And the answer is, we do. We can't do this alone. We need to work in order to be effective, working on these global public goods issues, and responding effectively to how China alters the context in which these issues present themselves to us here at home in the United States. We need to work with alliances. Through our alliances, we need to work with friends. And for that to happen, we need ourselves to be good friends. We need to demonstrate that we are good allies. And so ultimately, the reason that other countries are going to want to stand with us is that they believe us, they believe in us, they believe in our shared values, but we need to earn that. And I think at this point in time, as we launch into the 2020s, it's a very useful time to remember that we cannot take it for granted, that we need to live the values that we profess to hold, and the values we do live are going to be the ones that our allies and our foes are going to reckon with. So this is a useful time for us to think about the values we hold that drive the policy impetus. We're engaging in policy because we want to accomplish something. It's the values that we have that determines the direction we want to move. And ultimately, then it comes back to, it's not really about China. China is important, just as the moon is important for thinking about the movement of local tides. But ultimately, we want to think about the local tides. We want to think about where we want to go. We want to take into account the rise of China, but we want to do so in a way that's consistent with our values. That in turn will help strengthen our alliances. That in turn will help us deal effectively in a broader sphere with 190 plus countries out there in thinking about the kind of world we want to live in and what that means for us here at home. So that's a quick view. I invite you to browse around and look at some of the other presentations I posted that look at topical areas that may be close to the ones that you hold important. And love to hear from you, get your feedback, and thank you for your attention.